In the mid-19th century, the United States had achieved what it believed was its manifest destiny, the continental conquest of a vast, unbroken territory stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But once the American eye reached the western shore, the concept of destiny did not stop. It merely looked further west, out across the largest, most mysterious ocean on Earth. The Pacific Ocean was a vast, strategic void. America's whaling fleets roamed it freely. Its merchants eyed the mythical markets of China, and its politicians dreamed of a secure continental destiny. But to secure that destiny, the Navy needed ports, coaling stations, and allies. Directly in their path lay an ancient, isolated empire, a nation that had deliberately frozen itself in time for over 2 centuries, Japan. Since the early 1600s, the ruling Tokugawa shogunate had enforced a radical policy of sakoku, or closed country. Contact with the outside world was strictly forbidden. Foreigners who landed on Japanese soil were often imprisoned, sometimes executed. Trade was restricted to a single tiny Dutch outpost in Nagasaki harbor. This was a deliberate act of cultural preservation. The shogunate saw European influence, especially Christianity, as a dangerous contagion that threatened the traditional feudal structure. While the world outside industrialized, Japan remained a society of samurais, rice paddies, and Shinto temples. But this isolation was an unacceptable hazard to the ambitious, expansionist American state. U.S. whalers occasionally ran aground, and the sailors faced dire fates. More urgently, the U.S. Navy, increasingly dependent on steam power, desperately needed coaling stations to refuel its ships halfway across the Pacific en route to China. Japan was strategically located at a crossroads. Its continued isolation was seen not as sovereignty, but as an obstacle to global commerce. The man chosen to shatter this isolation was Commodore Matthew Calbraith Perry. Perry was a veteran naval officer, a firm believer in the power of technology, and a dedicated, if often imperious, practitioner of gunboat diplomacy. Perry's mission, authorized by President Millard Fillmore, was clear: open Japan to trade, ensure the safety of American sailors, and secure a coaling station. But the means were critical, coercion backed by overwhelming military spectacle. He sailed with the largest, most technologically advanced fleet Japan had ever witnessed. His ships were not the elegant sailing frigates of old, they were the black ships. Steam-powered warships, ironclad and black with coal dust, belching smoke that signaled unstoppable technological might. On July 8, 1853, Perry's 4 ships, 2 steam frigates and 2 sloops, steamed into Uraga Harbor near Edo, Tokyo, defying all Japanese laws. The effect was instantaneous and electrifying. Japanese officials, accustomed to the slow, predictable sail-powered ships of the Dutch, were paralyzed. The American ships moved against the wind and current, emitting fire and thunderous noise. The Japanese people called them kurafune, the black ships, and they were viewed as floating instruments of demons or gods. The Japanese quickly dispatched officials to demand the ships leave immediately. Perry refused, maintaining an aura of total, almost divine superiority. He refused to deal with any but the highest-ranking official, effectively treating the shogun's representatives as beneath him. He allowed a few low-ranking officials aboard, where they were given a carefully curated tour designed to showcase American technology. A steam-powered locomotive model, a telegraph machine that sent messages instantly across the ship, and a battery of massive polished cannons. The underlying message was clear: resist and face annihilation. Perry remained for 10 days, then withdrew to return the following year, leaving behind a letter from the U.S. president demanding a formal treaty. He had planted the seed of fear, knowing the Japanese leaders would spend the winter in turmoil over the decision. Perry returned in February 1854, this time with an even larger fleet of 9 ships. He did not ask permission. He anchored closer to Edo, the seat of the shogunate's power, effectively holding the capital hostage. The shogunate, facing both the impossible military reality of the Black Ships and mounting internal dissent, capitulated. On March 31, 1854, the Treaty of Kanagawa was signed. It was not a grand trade treaty, but it achieved Perry's core objectives. Opening of ports. The ports of Shimoda and Hakodate were opened to American ships for refueling and supplies. Sailor safety. Guaranteed good treatment for shipwrecked American sailors. Consulate. Allowed the U.S. to establish a consulate. This treaty was a triumph of American will and naval power projection. It signaled the first forceful geopolitical engagement of the U.S. in Asia. The immediate result was the end of Japan's 2 centuries of isolation and the eventual violent collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate. In the years that followed, Japan would undergo the Meiji Restoration, a process of rapid, frantic, and successful westernization. They would adopt the very technology that defeated them, transforming into a modern naval power, a naval power that would one day become America's greatest rival in the Pacific. The Black Ships had opened the door to the Pacific, but in doing so, they had unleashed a competitive dynamic that the U.S. did not fully understand. America had forged its first anchor in the Pacific, and it was paid for with the cultural shock and the technological intimidation of an ancient empire. If the opening of Japan was America's declaration of intent in the Pacific, then the Kingdom of Hawaii was the prize. Hawaii was not merely a cluster of beautiful islands. It was, as strategists called it, the Latchkey of the Pacific. Geographically, Hawaii sat at the perfect crossroads, a refueling stop and military staging ground, equidistant from the West Coast, Asia, and the Antipodes. Any nation controlling Hawaii controlled the flow of commerce and military power across the entire ocean. The U.S. realized that if a hostile power, Britain, France, or a rapidly modernizing Japan, seized the islands, the entire western seaboard of the United States would be vulnerable. But the American presence in Hawaii did not begin with the Navy. It began with the church and the sugar cane. The first wave of influential Americans arrived in the 1820s, Calvinist missionaries from New England. They were not seeking gold, but souls. They introduced literacy, established schools, and sought to convert the Hawaiian monarchy and people. While the missionaries' descendants often moved away from the pulpit, they never left the islands. Instead, they recognized the island's immense agricultural potential. The rich volcanic soil and perfect climate were ideal for growing sugarcane. These missionary families evolved into the powerful sugar barons, a tight-knit oligarchy that controlled land, commerce, banking, and government, often referred to as the Big Five firms. By the late 19th century, the native Hawaiian monarchy was deeply dependent on American economic interests. However, the monarchy still held political control, a situation the American-descended planters and businessmen found increasingly intolerable. The strategic importance of one specific natural harbor became the core issue: Pearl Harbor. In 1887, the United States leveraged the dependence of the reigning Hawaiian king, David Kalakaua, to gain exclusive rights to use Pearl Harbor as a naval coaling and repair station. This agreement was tied to a renewal of the Reciprocity Treaty, which allowed Hawaiian sugar to enter the U.S. tariff-free, a life-or-death necessity for the sugar barons. To ensure the U.S. got the deal, the American business faction forced King Kalakaua to sign the Bayonet Constitution of 1887. This was done under duress, with armed militias backing the American-led cabinet. The document stripped the monarchy of much of its power, disenfranchised most native Hawaiians, and guaranteed political control for the wealthy, land-owning foreign residents. This was the opening act of political conquest. The tension exploded with the ascension of the last reigning monarch, Queen Liliʻuokalani, in 1891. Liliʻuokalani was intelligent, nationalist, and fiercely determined to restore the sovereignty and dignity of her people. She viewed the bayonet constitution as an illegal outrage and immediately announced her intention to draft a new constitution that would restore power to the monarchy and to native Hawaiians. For the American annexationists, led by powerful figures like Sanford B. Dole, a lawyer and businessman descended from missionaries, this was an existential threat. A restored monarchy meant the end of their political control and potentially the end of the preferential sugar treaty with the United States. They chose to act swiftly and decisively before the Queen could rally popular support. The overthrow was not a popular uprising. It was a coup d'etat orchestrated by a small, heavily armed group of American and European businessmen styling themselves the Committee of Safety. The conspirators needed two things: legitimacy and force. They got the force when the U.S. Minister to Hawaii, John L. Stevens, a staunch supporter of annexation, took the outrageous, unauthorized step of landing 162 U.S. Marines from the USS Boston, which was anchored in the harbor. The Marines were not deployed to fight, but merely to occupy strategic locations near the Royal Palace. Their presence was a visual display of American military power that immediately legitimized and protected the conspirators. Facing overwhelming foreign military force, Queen Liliʻuokalani, advised by her ministers, chose not to shed the blood of her people. She surrendered under protest, issuing a formal statement: "I yield to the superior force of the United States of America." She trusted that the justice of the United States government, upon reviewing the facts, would eventually restore her to her rightful throne. The conspirators immediately declared the monarchy overthrown and established the provisional government of Hawaii with Sanford B. Dole as president. They rushed to Washington, D.C., expecting instant annexation. However, the new U.S. President, Grover Cleveland, was a man of principle. He ordered an investigation into the coup. The subsequent report from Special Commissioner James Blount concluded that the overthrow was an act of disgraceful conspiracy conducted by U.S. citizens aided by unauthorized U.S. military force. President Cleveland rejected the annexation treaty, calling the overthrow an act of war. He demanded that the provisional government disband and that Queen Liliʻuokalani be restored. But the sugar barons refused. They were backed by powerful Republican senators and knew that U.S. military interests, especially the need for Pearl Harbor, would ultimately win out over moral arguments. The provisional government simply waited out Cleveland's term, knowing that the strategic clock was ticking in their favor. The turning point came with the dawn of the Spanish-American War in 1898. With the outbreak of the war, the U.S. Navy needed to move massive amounts of troops and ships across the Pacific to strike the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. The strategic necessity of Hawaii as a coaling station and troop staging ground became undeniable, overriding all moral and legal objections. Under President William McKinley, who favored expansion, Congress passed the Newlands Resolution, not a treaty, which required a 2/3 Senate vote, but a joint resolution, requiring only a simple majority. In 1898, the United States officially annexed Hawaii. Queen Liliʻuokalani protested until her death, but the will of the sugar barons and the U.S. Navy had prevailed. The acquisition of Pearl Harbor, the finest natural harbor in the Pacific, secured the United States' main foothold in the ocean. It was the strategic pivot upon which all future Pacific power projection would hinge. Hawaii, acquired through a blend of commerce, coercion, and questionable military intervention, was now ready to serve as the undisputed gateway to the American empire in Asia. If the opening of Japan was America's declaration of intent in the Pacific, then the Kingdom of Hawaii was the prize. Hawaii was not merely a cluster of beautiful islands. It was, as strategists called it, the Latchkey of the Pacific. Geographically, Hawaii sat at the perfect crossroads, a refueling stop and military staging ground equidistant from the West Coast, Asia, and the Antipodes. Any nation controlling Hawaii controlled the flow of commerce and military power across the entire ocean. The US realized that if a hostile power, Britain, France, or a rapidly modernizing Japan, seized the islands, the entire western seaboard of the United States would be vulnerable. But the American presence in Hawaii did not begin with the Navy. It began with the church and the sugar cane. The first wave of influential Americans arrived in the 1820s. Calvinist missionaries from New England. They were not seeking gold but souls. They introduced literacy, established schools, and sought to convert the Hawaiian monarchy and people. While the missionaries' descendants often moved away from the pulpit, they never left the islands. Instead, they recognized the island's immense agricultural potential. The rich volcanic soil and perfect climate were ideal for growing sugarcane. These missionary families evolved into the powerful sugar barons, a tight-knit oligarchy that controlled land, commerce, banking, and government, often referred to as the Big Five firms. By the late 19th century, the native Hawaiian monarchy was deeply dependent on American economic interests. However, the monarchy still held political control, a situation the American-descended planters and businessmen found increasingly intolerable. The strategic importance of one specific natural harbor became the core issue: Pearl Harbor. In 1887, the United States leveraged the dependence of the reigning Hawaiian king, David Kalakaua, to gain exclusive rights to use Pearl Harbor as a naval coaling and repair station. This agreement was tied to a renewal of the Reciprocity Treaty, which allowed Hawaiian sugar to enter the U.S. tariff-free, a life-or-death necessity for the sugar barons. To ensure the U.S. got the deal, the American business faction forced King Kalakaua to sign the Bayonet Constitution of 1887. This was done under duress, with armed militias backing the American-led cabinet. The document stripped the monarchy of much of its power, disenfranchised most native Hawaiians, and guaranteed political control for the wealthy land-owning foreign residents. This was the opening act of political conquest. The tension exploded with the ascension of the last reigning monarch, Queen Liliʻuokalani, in 1891. Liliʻuokalani was intelligent, nationalist, and fiercely determined to restore the sovereignty and dignity of her people. She viewed the Bayonet Constitution as an illegal outrage and immediately announced her intention to draft a new constitution that would restore power to the monarchy and to native Hawaiians. For the American annexationists, led by powerful figures like Sanford B. Dole, a lawyer and businessman descended from missionaries, this was an existential threat. A restored monarchy meant the end of their political control and potentially the end of the preferential sugar treaty with the United States. They chose to act swiftly and decisively before the Queen could rally popular support. The overthrow was not a popular uprising. It was a coup d'etat orchestrated by a small, heavily armed group of American and European businessmen, styling themselves the Committee of Safety. The conspirators needed two things: legitimacy and force. They got the force when the U.S. Minister to Hawaii, John L. Stevens, a staunch supporter of annexation, took the outrageous, unauthorized step of landing 162 U.S. Marines from the USS Boston, which was anchored in the harbor. The Marines were not deployed to fight, but merely to occupy strategic locations near the Royal Palace. Their presence was a visual display of American military power that immediately legitimized and protected the conspirators. Facing overwhelming foreign military force, Queen Liliʻuokalani, advised by her ministers, chose not to shed the blood of her people. She surrendered under protest, issuing a formal statement: "I yield to the superior force of the United States of America." She trusted that the justice of the United States government, upon reviewing the facts, would eventually restore her to her rightful throne. The conspirators immediately declared the monarchy overthrown and established the provisional government of Hawaii with Sanford B. Dole as president. They rushed to Washington, D.C., expecting instant annexation. However, the new U.S. president, Grover Cleveland, was a man of principle. He ordered an investigation into the coup. The subsequent report from Special Commissioner James Blount concluded that the overthrow was an act of disgraceful conspiracy conducted by U.S. citizens, aided by unauthorized U.S. military force. President Cleveland rejected the Annexation Treaty, calling the overthrow an act of war. He demanded that the provisional government disband and that Queen Liliʻuokalani be restored. But the sugar barons refused. They were backed by powerful Republican senators and knew that U.S. military interests, especially the need for Pearl Harbor, would ultimately win out over moral arguments. The provisional government simply waited out Cleveland's term, knowing that the strategic clock was ticking in their favor. The turning point came with the dawn of the Spanish-American War in 1898. With the outbreak of the war, the U.S. Navy needed to move massive amounts of troops and ships across the Pacific to strike the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. The strategic necessity of Hawaii as a coaling station and troop staging ground became undeniable, overriding all moral and legal objections. Under President William McKinley, who favored expansion, Congress passed the Newlands Resolution, not a treaty, which required a two-thirds Senate vote, but a joint resolution requiring only a simple majority. In 1898, the United States officially annexed Hawaii. Queen Liliʻuokalani protested until her death, but the will of the sugar barons and the U.S. Navy had prevailed. The acquisition of Pearl Harbor, the finest natural harbor in the Pacific, secured the United States' main foothold in the ocean. It was the strategic pivot upon which all future Pacific power projection would hinge. Hawaii, acquired through a blend of commerce, coercion, and questionable military intervention, was now ready to serve as the undisputed gateway to the American empire in Asia. In the decade following the American Civil War, the U.S. Navy was a relic. Its fleet consisted mostly of slow wooden sailing ships left over from the conflict, useful primarily for policing coastal customs and chasing pirates. The nation was inward-looking, obsessed with continental expansion. European powers, meanwhile, were building massive coal-fired steel battleships, true instruments of imperial conquest. If the United States was to fulfill its manifest destiny in the Pacific, it needed more than acquired coaling stations. It needed an intellectual revolution, a comprehensive philosophy that proved sea power was indispensable to national greatness. That philosophy arrived not from the halls of Congress, but from the library of a middling naval officer, Alfred Thayer Mahan. Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, a history instructor at the Naval War College, was a theorist who rarely saw combat, but whose words would launch 1,000 warships. In 1890, Mahan published his masterpiece, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660-1783. He meticulously studied the rise and fall of global empires, from Rome to Britain, and drew one single, inescapable conclusion: national greatness is inextricably linked to control of the sea. Mahan argued that without a powerful, concentrated navy, a nation's commerce and colonies could not be protected, and therefore its power would inevitably decline. His work was not just history. It was a doctrine of imperial destiny, Mahan's core strategic requirements for global power, which became the official policy of the United States, were threefold. The concentrated fleet. A nation must build a massive, modern fleet of steel battleships, not for defense, but for offense. This big stick must be kept together, ready to destroy any enemy fleet in one decisive battle. The strategic coaling chain. To project power, the fleet requires a network of colonies and coaling stations to refuel, repair and rest. This justified the acquisition of Hawaii and any territory gained from future conflict. The canal. A transoceanic canal was essential to unify the Atlantic and Pacific fleets instantly, effectively doubling the Navy's power in either ocean. Mahan's book was an instant sensation, adopted as gospel not only by the US Navy, but by leaders in Britain, Germany, and most alarmingly, Imperial Japan. The man who internalized Mahan's philosophy and possessed the political will to enact it was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt, serving as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897, was obsessed with Mahan's work. He saw the impending conflict with Spain as the perfect opportunity to implement the Mahanian Doctrine. Roosevelt used his position to modernize the Navy, securing funding for new steel ships and ensuring that every modern vessel was equipped for offensive deep-water warfare. He single-handedly appointed Commodore George Dewey to command the Asiatic Squadron, making sure the most aggressive officer was stationed closest to the Spanish target, the Philippines. In 1898, while Secretary John D. Long was away for the afternoon, Roosevelt seized his opportunity. He sent a preemptive telegram to Dewey, instructing him in the event of war to proceed immediately to Manila and engage the Spanish fleet. This act of blatant, unauthorized preparation would irrevocably alter the course of American history. The Spanish-American War, which we will explore in the next chapter, was in essence the first Mahanian War, a conflict fought not to secure peace, but to secure the strategic coaling chain that Mahan had deemed essential for empire. Once Roosevelt became president in his own right, he was determined to prove that the United States had transformed from a regional power into a global naval superpower. He would execute Mahan's doctrine in the most spectacular fashion possible, the Great White Fleet Tour. In 1907, Roosevelt ordered 16 newly constructed battleships, the pride of the American Industrial Revolution, to embark on an unprecedented journey, an around-the-world circumnavigation. The ships were painted a gleaming, non-tactical white, a color chosen specifically for diplomatic spectacle rather than camouflage. This was not a secret military deployment. It was a global parade designed to be seen, studied, and feared. The entire undertaking was colossal, involving 14,000 sailors, spanning 43,000 miles, and lasting over 14 months. It was the ultimate demonstration of America's industrial capacity and its ability to sustain a massive fleet far from home. While the Great White Fleet's official purpose was peaceful training, its primary diplomatic target was unambiguous: Japan. In 1905, Japan had humiliated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, proving itself to be the first non-Western power capable of defeating a European military giant. Japan had also annexed Korea and was rapidly expanding its influence into China, territories America viewed as its own future commercial markets. The Japanese government, deeply versed in Mahan's philosophy, understood exactly what the Great White Fleet meant. When the fleet arrived in Tokyo Bay in October 1908, the sight of the gleaming white giants, fully operational and months away from their nearest American port, sent a shiver through the Japanese general staff. The visit was diplomatically lavish, featuring a grand welcome for Roosevelt's fleet. But beneath the courtesy, the message was stern. The Pacific is not a Japanese lake, and the United States has the industrial capacity to project overwhelming force to protect its new possessions. The Great White Fleet achieved exactly what Roosevelt intended. It showcased American power, trained a generation of naval officers for long-distance warfare, and solidified the global reputation of the U.S. as a naval power of the first rank. The black ships of the 1850s had opened the door. The Great White Fleet had kicked it wide open and permanently anchored American ambition in Asia. The stage was now set for the first great imperial acquisitions that this modernized fleet was designed to protect. The sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898 provided the catalyst for war, but the true prize for American imperialists lay thousands of miles away in the Pacific. For expansionists like Theodore Roosevelt and those dedicated to Mahan's doctrine, the war with Spain was not about Cuban independence. It was about coaling stations and colonies. The target was the Spanish colony of the Philippines, a vast archipelago that offered an indispensable coaling station, a naval base facing Asia, and a potential gateway to the lucrative China market. As we established, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt had already prepared the battlefield. Before war was even declared, he had ensured that the aggressive Mahan-trained Commodore George Dewey was positioned in Hong Kong, ready to strike. The order came late on April 24, 1898. Proceed at once to the Philippine Islands, commence operations. At once against the Spanish fleet, Dewey, commanding the 6 modern steel warships of the Asiatic Squadron, immediately sailed south toward the Philippines. This was a true test of Mahan's doctrine, a powerful, concentrated fleet sailing thousands of miles from the U.S. mainland to engage the enemy. The voyage was tense. Dewey's captains did not know the Spanish strength, the mine defenses of Manila Bay, or even if Spain had been reinforced. The success of the mission hinged on one critical assumption, that the Spanish fleet would be caught unprepared. In the pre-dawn darkness of May 1, 1898, Dewey's squadron, led by his flagship USS Olympia, slipped past the fortified entrance of Manila Bay. The Americans were spotted, and shore batteries opened fire. But the main Spanish fleet remained inside the vast harbor, confident the American ships would not dare breach the defenses. Dewey's fleet proceeded in a line, sails furled, steaming slowly toward the Spanish anchorage. In Cavite, at 5:40 a.m., the Asiatic Squadron reached the Spanish fleet. The scene was shocking to the Spanish, who faced a line of modern steel cruisers armed with heavy, long-range guns. The Spanish fleet, commanded by Admiral Patricio Montojo, consisted mostly of old, wooden, poorly maintained gunboats and cruisers. It was a mismatch of technology, training, and strategic doctrine. Dewey gave his now famous order, "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley." The American attack was methodical and devastating. Dewey's ships steamed back and forth in a firing line, delivering devastating broadsides into the Spanish vessels. The battle was fought at close quarters, maximizing the American advantage. In firepower and armor, the Spanish return fire was largely ineffective. Their shells often fell short or bounced harmlessly off the steel armor of the American ships. The Americans, however, aimed for the Spanish crews and the wooden hulls. One by one, the Spanish ships were set ablaze. At 7:30 a.m., Dewey performed a maneuver that bewildered the Spanish and secured his place in naval history. He ordered his fleet to disengage and retire from the battle line. The Spanish cheered, believing they had repulsed the American attack. But the American fleet was not damaged. Dewey had merely paused for breakfast. More practically, he needed a moment to accurately assess his ammunition and damage reports. After a brief, surreal break for coffee and bacon, Dewey ordered the fleet to return to the battle. The second engagement was swift and brutal. by 12:30 p.m., the Spanish Admiral Montojo was forced to scuttle his remaining ships to prevent their capture. The battle was over. The result was an astonishing one-sided victory. Spain, 10 ships sunk or destroyed, 161 sailors killed, 210 wounded. United States, 0 ships lost, only 9 men wounded, and only one of those wounds was serious. The Battle of Manila Bay was not just a naval victory. It was a Mahanian validation. It proved that a concentrated modern steel fleet, operating thousands of miles from home, could annihilate an enemy force and seize control of a crucial geographic territory. Dewey had destroyed the Spanish fleet, but he had not conquered the Philippines. He now controlled Manila Bay, but the city itself was defended by a Spanish garrison, and the countryside was dominated by the Filipino independence movement. The Filipino resistance was led by Emilio Aguinaldo, a revolutionary whom Dewey immediately brought back from exile to lead the independence fight against Spain. Aguinaldo and his forces quickly surrounded Manila, believing the Americans had come to liberate them. Washington, D.C. now faced a terrifying reality. It had accidentally acquired a full-fledged, potentially rebellious colony in Asia. President McKinley later confessed that he didn't even know where the Philippines were when the war started. McKinley agonized over the decision. Should the U.S. simply hand the islands back to Spain, allow Filipino independence, or should the U.S. take the islands as a necessary imperial possession? He later claimed that he prayed for guidance, and the divine answer was clear. The U.S. must take the islands, not only for strategic benefit, but to uplift and civilize and Christianize the Filipinos. The official rhetoric of manifest destiny was now applied to a non-contiguous multiracial empire in Asia. The war formally ended with the Treaty of Paris in December 1898. The treaty solidified the birth of the American Empire. Cuba was granted independence, though remained a U.S. protectorate. Puerto Rico and Guam were ceded directly to the United States. Guam, strategically positioned in the Western Pacific, became another indispensable coaling station and naval base. The Philippines were purchased from Spain for the sum of $20 million. The acquisition of these territories gave the U.S. its long-sought strategic chain across the Pacific: Hawaii, annexed in 1898, Guam and the Philippines. The American flag now flew over a vast, non-contiguous empire stretching from the Caribbean to Asia. The victory at Manila Bay had successfully leveraged naval firepower to forge an empire. But the true cost of that empire, the price of subjugating millions of people who desired their own independence, was about to be paid in a brutal, hidden conflict that few Americans at home would ever truly acknowledge. The era of easy expansion was over. The era of bloody imperial policing had begun. The Battle of Manila Bay secured America's foothold in the Pacific, but the purchase of the Philippines for $20 million was immediately followed by a steep, bloody price paid by American soldiers and Filipino civilians. The conflict that followed, known to Americans as the Philippine Insurrection and to Filipinos as the Philippine-American War, is the moral scar on the face of the nascent American empire. The betrayal was swift and absolute. As established, the U.S. brought Filipino independence leader Emilio Aguinaldo back from exile, viewing him as a useful tool against the Spanish. Aguinaldo, in turn, declared the First Philippine Republic, fully believing the Americans were there as liberators. But the moment the Treaty of Paris ceded the islands from Spain to the U.S., the relationship curdled into mutual suspicion. The American forces, having defeated the Spanish, ordered the Filipino forces to withdraw from the perimeter of Manila. Aguinaldo's men, who had surrounded the city and were prepared to liberate their capital, realized the truth. The Spanish occupiers had simply been traded for American ones. On the night of February 4, 1899, a small disputed clash occurred between U.S. troops and Filipino forces outside Manila. It was the spark that ignited the brutal three-year war. The Philippine-American War was not a grand Mahanian naval battle. It was a grueling, localized and vicious counterinsurgency fought in dense jungles, remote villages, and punishing heat. Initially, Aguinaldo attempted to fight a conventional war, but the heavily armed, well-supplied American forces quickly drove his army out of the cities and into the mountainous interiors. The Filipino forces were then forced to adopt the tactics of guerrilla warfare, ambush, sabotage, and the blending of combatants with the civilian population. The U.S. military, trained for traditional warfare, struggled to adapt. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The local population was often silently hostile, and the oppressive climate led to widespread disease and frustration among American soldiers. The war lasted until 1902, though sporadic fighting continued for years after, and required the deployment of over 126,000 American troops, far more than were used to defeat Spain itself. As the war dragged on, American frustration mounted, leading to the use of increasingly harsh and ethically dubious tactics, much like those used in later 20th century conflicts. Concentration zones. To separate the guerrillas from their support base, U.S. commanders established reconcentration camps, forcing civilians from outlying areas into centralized zones controlled by the military. Outside these zones, anything that moved was often assumed to be the enemy. These camps were poorly supplied, leading to rampant starvation and disease that killed thousands of Filipinos, a tactic widely criticized at the time as mirroring Spanish brutality in Cuba. The water cure. American troops frequently resorted to torture to extract information on rebel positions. The most notorious method was the water cure, a precursor to modern waterboarding, where large amounts of water were forced into a victim's stomach to simulate drowning. No prisoners. The fighting on both sides devolved into extreme cruelty. American soldiers often referred to Filipinos with racial slurs and adopted a terrifying policy of taking no prisoners. Commanders often ordered the execution of captured combatants, believing they were dealing with savages rather than a legitimate army. The orders given to commanders in the field sometimes spoke of total war. General Jacob Smith, when ordering the devastation of the island of Samar, reportedly told his troops, "I want no prisoners. I wish you to kill and burn. The more you kill and burn, the better it will please me." The official casualty count reveals the immense cost of this imperial acquisition. American casualties. Over 4,200 soldiers died, mostly from disease. Filipino casualties. Estimates vary widely, but most historians agree that over 20,000 Filipino soldiers died in combat. And the civilian death toll due to famine, disease, and violence ranged from 200,000 to 500,000. The US had purchased the islands for $20 million from Spain, but the true cost was paid in hundreds of thousands of lives. The war officially concluded in 1901 when General Frederick Funston, a colorful but ruthless commander, used a brilliant ruse to capture Emilio Aguinaldo. Funston and his men, disguised as captured American soldiers and escorted by loyal Filipino scouts, infiltrated Aguinaldo's remote headquarters. Aguinaldo was forced to take an oath of allegiance to the United States and called upon his troops to surrender. While sporadic resistance continued, the backbone of the Filipino resistance was broken. The United States had won the war and secured its territory, but the conflict had a profound effect at home. The morality of the war divided the American public, fueling a powerful anti-imperialist league that included Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, who condemned the war as a betrayal of American democratic principles. Despite the moral outcry, the imperialists succeeded. The Philippines became a crucial anchor for the US Navy's presence in Asia, serving as the ultimate forward base for projecting commercial and military power into China and Southeast Asia. The US poured resources into its new territory, building schools, roads, and infrastructure, all aimed at solidifying its control. The US Navy, having proved its ability to acquire and hold distant possessions, now needed to ensure these possessions were defensible. This massive new commitment, defending a sprawling, non-contiguous Pacific empire, necessitated the final piece of Mahan's doctrine. The Navy needed to unify its two great fleets in the Atlantic and the Pacific. It needed to break the barrier of the American continents. It needed a canal. The very brutality of the Philippine Insurrection highlighted the vulnerability of the US position. It took too long to move men and materials from the Atlantic. The next great challenge would be a feat of engineering, driven entirely by the strategic needs of the new American empire. The triumph at Manila Bay had birthed an empire spanning two oceans, but the logistical reality of defending it exposed a crippling vulnerability. The Spanish-American War gave the United States its most urgent, compelling argument for overcoming the final geographical obstacle, the continents themselves. In March 1898, before the war was even declared, the battleship USS Oregon was stationed in San Francisco to reinforce the Atlantic fleet preparing to face the Spanish in Cuba. The Oregon was ordered to sail immediately to the Caribbean. The Oregon embarked on a 14,000-mile, 66-day journey around the treacherous, freezing waters of Cape Horn, at the tip of South America. While the ship arrived safely and on time to participate in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba, the voyage was a strategic nightmare. 66 days was an eternity in modern naval warfare. Had the Pacific Fleet faced a crisis, say, a concerted attack on the Philippines or Hawaii, the Atlantic Fleet would have been utterly incapable of rendering timely aid. The lesson was stark. The United States, as a global two-ocean power, was only half a power. Its fleets were physically separated by thousands of miles of hostile water. The dream of sea power, the very core of Mahan's doctrine, demanded a unified fleet. It demanded a canal. The French, under the leadership of Ferdinand de Lesseps, the builder of the Suez Canal, had already attempted to build a sea-level canal through the narrowest point of the Isthmus of Panama in the 1880s. Their effort was a catastrophic failure. They were defeated not by rock and earth, but by disease. Yellow fever and malaria decimated the workforce, killing over 20,000 workers. The project collapsed in financial ruin, leaving behind rusting machinery, half-dug trenches, and a haunted sense of impossibility. When the US decided to build the canal, they had two options: the Panamanian route, which was shorter but treacherous, or the Nicaraguan route, which was longer but politically simpler. The US ultimately chose Panama despite its problems, driven by two powerful forces: the French company's willingness to sell their abandoned equipment cheaply and the aggressive political will of Theodore Roosevelt. In 1903, the territory of Panama was not an independent nation. It was a province of Colombia. Roosevelt attempted to negotiate a treaty with Colombia to lease the land for the canal zone. The Colombian Senate, viewing the deal as exploitative and the French assets as worthless, rejected the treaty, seeking better terms. Roosevelt was furious. He considered the Colombian government a collection of greedy little bandits standing in the way of global progress and American strategic necessity. He decided to employ the most ruthless political tool of the emerging American empire: regime change. Roosevelt privately encouraged and then openly supported a group of Panamanian nationalists and French company representatives who were plotting a revolution to gain independence from Colombia. On November 3, 1903, the Panamanian Revolution began. It lasted for a single brief, farcical day. Crucially, as the Colombian forces prepared to cross the isthmus to suppress the revolt, the USS Nashville, a U.S. Navy gunboat, and other naval vessels strategically arrived in Colon Harbor. The U.S. forces, under orders from Roosevelt, landed Marines and effectively blocked the Colombian army from moving across the isthmus. Colombia, lacking the naval strength to challenge the United States, was left with no option but to watch as their province declared independence. Within 3 days, the newly independent Republic of Panama signed the Guano Treaty, granting the U.S. a 10-mile-wide perpetual lease on the Canal Zone and giving the United States sovereign rights as if it were the sovereign of the territory. It was a brilliant, breathtakingly cynical gambit, a blatant use of naval power to secure an essential piece of global infrastructure. As Roosevelt later boasted, "I took the Canal Zone." Securing the political landscape was only the first step. The true war began against the environment. The project's chief engineers realized that until they conquered disease, the canal would remain a tomb. The man tasked with this medical miracle was Colonel William C. Gorgas, an army physician who had already proven that yellow fever and malaria were transmitted by mosquitoes, not by foul air. Gorgas launched an unprecedented military-style campaign against the insect population. He ordered the drainage of every swamp, the oiling of every pool of standing water, and the massive fumigation of every building in Panama City and Colon. Homes were screened, and barrels of larvae-killing oil were deployed across the zone. Securing the political landscape was only the first step. The true war began against the environment. The project's chief engineers realized that until they conquered disease, the canal would remain a tomb. The man tasked with this medical miracle was Colonel William C. Gorgas, an army physician who had already proven that yellow fever and malaria were transmitted by mosquitoes, not by foul air. Gorgas launched an unprecedented military-style campaign against the insect population. He ordered the drainage of every swamp, the oiling of every pool of standing water, and the massive fumigation of every building in Panama City and Colon. Homes were screened, and barrels of larvae-killing oil were deployed across the zone. The workers initially scoffed, but the results were undeniable and dramatic. Within 2 years, the incidence of yellow fever, the disease that had destroyed the French effort, dropped to near zero. Malaria rates plummeted. This victory over disease was arguably the most important engineering feat of the entire project. The US had proved it could not only take the territory, but it could tame the tropics and create a livable, working environment necessary for global empire. With the environment secured, the Americans faced the sheer brute force challenge of the Earth itself. They inherited the French trenches and equipment, but implemented an entirely new, gargantuan design. A lock canal, which would lift ships over the continental divide rather than a sea-level cut. The project spanned 10 years, cost nearly $400 million, an unprecedented sum, and employed over 40,000 workers at its peak. The greatest challenge was the Culebra Cut, later renamed the Gaillard Cut, a 9-mile channel sliced through the mountain ridge. Workers removed over 100 million cubic yards of rock and earth in this section alone, battling perpetual landslides that threatened to bury the channel as fast as it was dug. The final triumph was the construction of the massive Gatun locks, a colossal concrete structure that allowed ships to be raised 85 feet to the level of the artificial Gatun Lake and then lowered back down to the sea. The lock gates were engineering marvels in themselves, steel titans weighing 700 tons apiece. The entire project was a spectacular, almost unbelievable demonstration of American industrial power, technological ingenuity, and bureaucratic efficiency, all channeled toward a single, overriding strategic objective. On August 15, 1914, the Panama Canal officially opened. The timing was historically poetic. The world was plunging into World War I, and the strategic importance of the canal was instantly magnified. The canal achieved Mahan's ultimate vision. It unified the Atlantic and Pacific fleets. The sailing, time between the two oceans was cut from 2 months to 10 hours. The canal effectively doubled American naval power, allowing the nation to rapidly shift its force in response to any threat, whether in the Caribbean, the Pacific, or Europe. The black ships, the coaling stations, the annexation of Hawaii, and the brutal acquisition of the Philippines all led to this single crucial point. The Panama Canal was the physical manifestation of American global power. It gave the U.S. Navy the ability to patrol and enforce its will across 2 hemispheres simultaneously. The empire, paid for in blood and gold, disease and diplomacy, was finally linked together. But this colossal projection of power had not gone unnoticed by the most ambitious rising power in Asia, the very nation that America's first black ships had forced open. The next great naval challenge was looming on the horizon: Imperial Japan. Commodore Perry's black ships of 1853 had shattered the isolation of Japan, but the unintended consequence was the creation of a powerful modern rival determined to carve out its own Pacific destiny. By the early 20th century, Imperial Japan had fully embraced the Mahanian doctrine of sea power and applied it with devastating success. Japan had shocked the world by decisively defeating a European giant, Russia, in 1905. It had annexed Korea and was aggressively asserting its control over Manchuria and China. Japan was no longer a vulnerable target for American commerce. It was a competitor for imperial dominance in Asia. The acquisition of the Philippines, Guam, and the Panama Canal solidified America's empire, but it also placed the U.S. directly on Japan's doorstep. The core of the emerging conflict was stark. America saw the Pacific as a U.S.-protected route to China. Japan saw the Pacific as the necessary foundation for its own Asian empire. The mutual suspicion quickly escalated into a full-blown naval arms race, a race measured in tons of steel, caliber of guns, and range of projection. Japan's strategy, driven by an acute awareness of its limited resources and distance from the U.S. mainland, was centered on achieving naval superiority in the Western Pacific. They invested heavily in capital ships and, crucially, developed tactics and ships that could deliver a knockout blow to the U.S. fleet before it could be reinforced across the vast ocean. The U.S. response was measured by the Vinson Acts and massive shipbuilding campaigns designed to adhere to the principle of parity. American ship designers focused on building ships with superior endurance and range, capable of making the trans-Pacific voyage. The focus shifted to the concept of the dreadnought and later the aircraft carrier. The U.S. knew that the Panama Canal was the strategic linchpin, allowing the fleet to concentrate, but the vast distance to Asia meant the U.S. fleet would be constantly operating far from its supply base, a major vulnerability. As tensions grew, the U.S. Navy and Army embarked on a decades-long project that laid bare the strategic reality of the Pacific. A war with Japan was not merely possible, it was inevitable. This project was War Plan Orange, a series of detailed, interlocking war plans developed from the 1920s through the 1940s that meticulously mapped out every stage of a U.S.-Japan conflict. War Plan Orange was the strategic Bible of the US Navy. It revealed the sheer impossibility of defending the entire US Pacific Empire simultaneously, the loss of the outposts. The planners accepted that in the event of war, Japan would immediately seize the vulnerable, distant outposts of the Philippines and Guam. Defending them was deemed logistically impossible. The slow march. The US strategy was termed the island-hopping strategy long before World War II began. It envisioned a slow, deliberate march across the Central Pacific, a 10,000-mile advance relying on the chain of islands, Hawaii, Midway, Wake, Guam, as stepping stones. The climax. The plan aimed for one final decisive battle, the Mahanian climax near the Japanese home islands, where the superior industrial capacity of the United States would ultimately overwhelm the Japanese Navy. War Plan Orange was a massive, classified undertaking that focused relentlessly on logistics. How many tons of coal, how many gallons of oil, how many hospital ships, and how many battleships would be needed for each phase of the advance. The entire American security presence in the Pacific was now defined by this single, grim prediction. Even as War Plan Orange took shape, American strategists understood the critical vulnerability. Pearl Harbor, the base in Hawaii, the Latchkey of the Pacific, was both the indispensable staging area for the march across the ocean and the most tempting target for a Japanese knockout blow. If Japan could destroy the US fleet at Pearl Harbor, it would delay the American advance by months, if not years, giving Japan time to secure the perimeter of its new Asian empire. Naval exercises held in the 1930s, like the famous Fleet Problem 19, demonstrated this vulnerability. US planners successfully simulated a surprise carrier-based air attack on Pearl Harbor that crippled the defending forces, proving the base was susceptible to a swift, overwhelming aerial assault. The vulnerability was understood, but due to complacency and the belief that no enemy would dare attempt such a bold attack, the warning was largely ignored. The naval arms race was matched by an escalating diplomatic conflict, primarily centered on China. The US policy of the open door championed free trade for all nations in China, a direct threat to Japan's desire to establish exclusive economic and political control over the resource-rich mainland. As the 1930s progressed, Japanese imperial aggression increased. Their full-scale invasion of China in 1937 violated all international norms and brought strong condemnation from the United States. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, increasingly alarmed by Japanese expansion, began to implement severe economic measures aimed at slowing Japan's war machine. The scrap iron embargo. The US stopped selling iron and steel, crucial raw materials for Japanese military production. The oil embargo, the final devastating blow. By 1941, the US cut off oil exports to Japan. Japan, which imported 90% of its oil, now faced the collapse of its economy and military within 2 years. For the Japanese military leadership, led by the naval genius Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the choice was brutally simple. Either suffer a slow economic strangulation orchestrated by the United States, or launch a massive, preemptive military strike to seize the oil and rubber resources of Southeast Asia, a strike that would inevitably involve the destruction of the US Pacific Fleet. The Japanese decision was made. The time for diplomacy was over. The stage set by the black ships, the treaties, the coaling stations, and the naval buildup had reached its violent ultimate conclusion. The long, slow, strategic march to war was ending. The next moment would be sudden, brutal, and permanently etched into American history. The complex game of imperial chess, the search for coaling stations, the acquisition of Hawaii, the naval buildup dictated by Mahan, and the strategic tensions outlined in War Plan Orange, all converged on a single fateful point, the morning of Sunday, December 7th, 1941. In Washington, D.C., negotiations between the U.S. and Japan were at a final, deadlocked impasse. The United States was firm on its oil embargo. Japan was firm on its right to an empire in China. On the high seas, however, the real answer to the impasse was already in motion. Since November, a massive Japanese carrier fleet commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had been sailing under strict radio silence across the vast, empty expanse of the North Pacific. Its target was the prized strategic jewel of the American Pacific Empire, Pearl Harbor. The planning for the attack had been meticulous, drawn directly from the successful U.S. naval exercises of the 1930s. The Japanese knew the American fleet would be concentrated in the harbor on a Sunday, anchored in neat, vulnerable rows. The goal was not conquest, but paralysis, a knockout blow that would cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet long enough for Japan to seize the vital oil and rubber resources of Southeast Asia. Despite the decade of planning under War Plan Orange, and despite numerous low-level intelligence warnings, the American High Command in Hawaii remained complacent. Their attention was focused on sabotage fears rather than a massive aerial assault from the sea. The defenses were at minimum readiness. Anti-aircraft, guns were unmanned. Patrol planes were parked wingtip to wingtip, making them easy targets. And the ships of the Pacific Fleet, including 8 massive battleships, were moored together in Battleship Row, presenting one single tempting target. The stage was set for the ultimate strategic surprise. At 6 a.m., the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft Zeeks, Kates and Vals launched from the 6 carriers hidden hundreds of miles to the north. Their mission was clear: destroy the battleships and the aircraft carriers. Just before 7:55 a.m., the first bombs dropped. The attack was a symphony of destructive efficiency. Torpedo bombers. The first to strike were the torpedo planes, flying low over the water. They were armed with newly modified torpedoes, designed specifically to run in the shallow waters of the harbor, a technological surprise the U.S. did not anticipate. They focused relentlessly on the battleships, dive bombers, and high-level bombers. These aircraft targeted airfields, hangars, and the decks of the battleships, ensuring American air power could not retaliate. The sound of the attack was deafening. The whine of Japanese engines, the scream of diving planes, the roar of explosions, and the desperate, scattered noise of American anti-aircraft fire. Sailors, roused from their sleep, ran to battle stations on ships that were already listing. Within minutes, the full devastation was clear. The USS Arizona was destroyed by a high-level bomb that penetrated its forward magazine, causing a colossal explosion that lifted the battleship clean out of the water. Over 100 men were instantly killed, trapped in the sunken, burning hull, a devastating loss that became the permanent symbol of the day. The USS Oklahoma was hit by multiple torpedoes and rapidly capsized, trapping hundreds of men inside its inverted hull. In total, 5 battleships were sunk and 3 were severely damaged. Cruisers, destroyers, and service vessels were hit. Airfields were littered with burning American aircraft. The Japanese pilots executed their mission with brutal precision. They achieved almost total tactical surprise, crippling the main fighting force of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. Yet, for all its spectacular devastation, the attack was, in a larger strategic sense, an incomplete failure. The Japanese had committed a series of crucial errors that guaranteed their ultimate defeat. The carriers were absent. The 3 U.S. Pacific Fleet aircraft carriers, Lexington, Enterprise, and Saratoga, were all at sea on assignment that morning. The Japanese, obsessively focused on the battleships, the traditional capital ship, missed their primary long-term targets, the very vessels that would win the Pacific War. Infrastructure was intact. The Japanese High Command called off the planned third wave. As a result, they failed to destroy the most critical assets, the massive oil storage facilities and the ship-repaired dry docks at Pearl Harbor. The lack of oil would have instantly paralyzed the fleet, and the destruction of the dry docks would have meant the entire fleet would have to return to the West Coast for repairs. Because these survived, the U.S. was able to repair and return most of the damaged battleships to service surprisingly quickly. The nation was unified. The attack, far from crippling the American will, instantly unified a divided nation. The shock and rage turned a reluctant populace into a force committed to total unrelenting war. The attack killed 2,503 Americans and wounded thousands more. It shattered the Navy's strategic timetable, temporarily giving Japan free rein to seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. But the real effect of Pearl Harbor was to prove the strategic necessity of every imperial step the U.S. had taken over the previous 90 years. The coaling stations, the annexation of Hawaii, the commitment to the Philippines, all were necessary to fight this new, terrifying global war. The war that followed was the ultimate climactic test of Mahan's doctrine and the largest naval conflict in history. The U.S. Navy, now humbled but furiously mobilized, would embark on the slow, bloody, island-by-island march across the Pacific, exactly as envisioned in War Plan Orange. The black ships of war had finally sailed into their ultimate battle. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the brutal fighting across the Philippines, and the bloody battles of World War II were the final, destructive culmination of the pressures unleashed nearly a century earlier by the arrival of the black ships in Japan. The U.S. Navy, following the strategic imperatives laid down by Alfred Thayer Mahan, had systematically acquired the necessary coaling stations, secured the indispensable anchor of Pearl Harbor, built the unifying Panama Canal, and fought the brutal war in the Philippines, all to ensure the ability to project power into Asia. The victory of 1945 did not dissolve the American empire, it cemented it. The nature of the empire changed. It shifted from one of non-contiguous territorial possession, lands like the Philippines which were granted independence, to one of global security and economic dominance. The strategic Pacific chain, once based on coal and guano, became a chain of massive permanent military bases. Japan, South Korea, Guam, and above course, Hawaii. The U.S. Navy, now the largest and most powerful maritime force the world had ever seen, became the sole guarantor of stability and commerce across the Pacific. The cost of this ascendancy was staggering, paid for by the lives lost in the Philippine Insurrection, the political injustice done to Queen Liliʻuokalani, and the immense sacrifice of World War II. Yet, the final strategic vision was realized. The U.S. emerged as the undisputed naval master of both the Atlantic and the Pacific. The canal ensures swift fleet movement. The former coaling stations serve as massive naval and air hubs. The once vulnerable Asian markets are protected by the same navy that once forced them open. The legacy of the black ships is complex and enduring. Global commerce. The U.S. Navy ensures the safety of the sea lanes, allowing for the massive flow of Pacific commerce that defines the modern global economy. Technological supremacy, the constant naval arms race, and the drive for technological perfection, from the steel cruiser to the nuclear submarine, were born out of the Mahanian necessity to dominate the Pacific. The American century, by securing the Pacific, the united States successfully averted the rise of a sustained, hostile Eurasian power that could challenge its economic and political global leadership, effectively ushering in the American century. From the first puff of coal smoke in Tokyo Bay in 1853 to the final deployment of carrier strike groups today, the story of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific is the story of American global power. It is a saga of expansion fueled by economic greed, driven by strategic philosophy, and paid for by relentless military power projection. The Black Ships of War did not just forge an empire. They charted the course for the modern American security state, a state forever committed to guarding the vast, silent waters of the Pacific, the same waters that now define the economic future of the world. Thank you for listening to The Black Ships of War, How the U.S. Navy Forged an Empire in the Pacific on History by Blood Audiobook. If this story of naval strategy and empire captivated you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing you unique, long-form historical audiobooks. Let us know in the comments below. Do you believe the acquisition of the Panama Canal was justified by the strategic needs of the U.S. Navy, or was it a permanent stain on American diplomacy?